Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah Rapaner. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. Do you own a scale at home? And if you step on that scale, do you instantly have a feeling of dread or anxiety or fear or shame or all of those negative emotions? And when you step on that scale, does it automatically calculate for you this thing called BMI? And then do you start to think, oh God, am I in the normal weight? I'm in the overweight, the underweight, or the obese weight? I don't have a scale. I threw away my scale. In part because I used to do this all the time. I used to step on a scale and try to track where I was, plus minus 5 pounds, and calculate my BMI. And if I was out of a quote unquote normal range, I would feel awful. It would mess with how my day started. And so over time, I decided this just wasn't worth it. I don't even actually have the doctors tell me the weight. I don't ask for it because, to be honest with you, I don't care. I'm living my best life. And if that little number on the scale that then gets calculated into some sort of index about whether I'm good is going to ruin my day, I don't want to know. There is so much more joy, love, pleasure, excitement, beauty in the world than your BMI. Than your weight. So, on today's Misperceived, we're going to unpack the misperception. Is BMI biased against women? I'm going to talk to you today about an article from Rachel Prey and Suzanne Riskin. And they have this article, and you can get it online. It's coming from the census, right? And so it's out, it's available, and it's pretty short. It's only 7 pages. So if you're interested, you can read it. And their article is titled, "The History and Faults of the Body Mass Index and Where to Look Next, a Literature Review." Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about their method. So what we do as academics sometimes is we do these kind of meta reviews. And the idea is we go out and we search up all the literature that has certain words in it, like BMI or women or, race. And we collate thousands and thousands and thousands of articles. And, in this case, they had, I think, over 7,000 articles. And then we look to see which of these articles kind of align with our selection criteria, and then we summarize them. So I want you to think about this as like a literature review or a summary or this kind of research project about the research that's out there that's strategic and has this kind of methodology coming behind it to make sure they're getting what they want and they're isolating the articles that are actually speaking to the questions they want. And the reason we do this is because we want to get some sort of a summary. We want to get some sort of idea of what's happening. What have people researched? So they're doing that in this article, and they're making 2 contributions. The first contribution is to talk about the evolution of BMI. How did it emerge? And the second thing they do is they're talking about where can we go from here in terms of developing a measure of our health or our weight and what looks promising. I'm going to talk to you about the first, and then I'm going to tell you why I don't like the second, but we'll get into that in turn. Are you ready? So let's talk about the history of BMI. This idea that we have a body mass index emerges in 1832. And basically, there's this guy, Adolphe Quetelet. He was born, I'm going to say it again, in 1796 to 1874. We're using this measure that came from the 1700s to determine whether we are valuable. Okay. And he was this statistician and a mathematician. And he was interested in this idea of how do we quantify or how do we measure what is quote unquote the normal man. Emphasis on the man. This was a period of time where people are starting to think about, how do we collect up data to understand variation in the population, and how do we find where you might fall in, say, height or weight, right? This is a period of time where they're really just building out statistical analysis. Like they're trying to understand, how do we capture or quantify people, and where do they sit on what is called a distribution? Like height could be, from shortest to highest. And what does the count look like? It's just a graph, right? They're just graphing people's characteristics. And this seems really obvious now, but it has to emerge somewhere. It has to develop out of some sort of philosophical or scientific thought. And so that's the first person who's just trying to capture what is the variation and people's height and weight, right? And so he develops this quintillate index, and it's basically weight divided by height and then multiplied squared, so timesing it by itself. When I say that to you, weight divided by height, that's the BMI, right? We're taking our weight and dividing it by height. So the preliminary idea of building out a BMI, I'm going to say it to you again, is coming from someone born in 1796 who developed this idea in 1832 just to see the distribution. This idea of capturing people's weight divided by height or some sort of measure like that as an indicator of their health then reemerges in 1950 from Lewis Dublin, who is the vice president of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. And if we think about life insurance companies, right, they're trying to figure out, who do I invest in that is, I'm not basically going to have to pay them out, right? Like that's the goal. The goal is we have a lot of healthy people in the pool to help support the less healthy people. And so the idea would be, who do you let into the pool? Because you need more healthy people in the pool. You need more people who you're not going to have to pay out to pay for the rest. And so he takes this and he has kind of three categories. He's looking at, height and weight, and then delineating people's frame. So whether they're small, whether they're medium, and whether they're large. Okay, so those are the two. Next comes 1972, psychologist Ansel Keys. And he then comes up with this idea of body mass index to indicate whether people are healthy or not. The challenge is, and let me tell you exactly how he built out this index. He builds this index out by looking at a cohort of 7,426 healthy men. BMI never had any women in it. The development of the body mass index in terms of underweight, average weight or quote unquote normal weight, overweight, and obesity was built based on a study from 1972 from a sample of only men. When we look at this study, the original Ansel study to build out BMI, it was looking at the following groups. It had a couple of cohorts. So I told you there's over 7,000 people, but he was drawing a range of cohorts. He was drawing, one group that were men, say 31 to 60, one group that was men 18 to 24, and these were students at University of Minnesota, one group that were men 49 to 59, and these are called the Minnesota executives. And then he tried to get kind of a wider range of men, 40 to 59, from different racial backgrounds. But it's important to note that of that 7,426 men, and again, men, only 1.5% were South African descent, only 13% were of Asian descent, and these were Japanese farmers and Japanese fishermen. And really the most of the cohort is coming from men from Europe, from Eastern Finland, or from Western Finland, or from Italy. And so this measure is based on men and mostly white men. Now, what we've learned from BMI is that it's often pretty inaccurate in predicting health outcomes for different racial groups and for women versus men. And part of that is just because it doesn't think about where the fat is located. They talk about this, the distribution of fat within the body, that men tend to hold more fat in the belly, that women tend to hold more fat in the glutes. They call it like glutinous, but it's really just their butts, right? Like women tend to hold fat in their lower body, and that the belly fat can be the more dangerous, right, for your cardiovascular health. And then it talks a lot about in this article, different racial groups that have different body types just biologically, and how this doesn't account for the fact that, you can be taller or shorter, you can be thinner, you can be larger, you can be more muscular, right? It doesn't account for any of this variability in the ways in which our weight develops, in part based on our genetic predisposition or our body type or our size. And so it can be really inaccurate in predicting a range of health outcomes for different racial groups. It can be really inaccurate in predicting a bunch of health outcomes for women. And in part, as they talk about, there's physiological and hormonal differences, in particular between women and men. And so it's kind of perhaps unsurprising that when we think about how BMI is going to predict our health outcomes, it can be really bad for certain groups. That using the same idea of BMI classification, again, built in the 1970s based on a cohort of 7,000 men, it's not accurate often in predicting risk. And what it can do is be actually terribly predictive for groups that have different body types. That, they're talking about, if you're trying to base whether I am healthy based on a white man, it's going to get me wrong. And so this is actually a pretty inaccurate measure. It might be good at predicting men's mortality, and in particular, white men's mortality. But if we're using it to predict health outcomes, or we're using it to shame women because having lower BMI is supposed to lead to better health, then we're going to get it wrong. And what can happen, as they point out, is that it can delay certain diagnosis, it can delay certain treatment, and it can lead to actually worse health outcomes. It can lead to mortality if we're using this inaccurate measure. So that's the first contribution of this work. They're talking about the history and the evolution of this, and really showing you if you're putting a huge amount of value in your BMI, I want you to think about, again, a measure built on men from 1970s, from an idea that came from the 1800s by someone who was born in the 1700s. It's an inaccurate measure. And then they offer a range of other suggestions about different ways to measure health. And they talk about things like, maybe we measure our health through our waist circumference, or maybe we measure health through our neck circumference, or maybe we measure health through our body fat or our shape of our body. I don't think this is a good idea. I mean, I know we need to potentially get some measure of health, but let me make a suggestion. I think if we're focusing on the ways in which we carry fat within the body, we're missing the bigger point. I would like our health to be measured by: how many times have you laughed in the following week? How many times have you connected with your friends? Do you have access to high quality, nutritious food? Is that affordable? What about the water? Are you drinking tainted water? Do you have a house where you have space to go outside, to play? Do you live in a food desert? Do you have access to green space? What about noise pollution? What about air pollution? We are so focused on fixing our individual bodies and telling people that what they need to do is keep track of how much they weigh and how much they weigh vis-a-vis their height, and then punish themselves for not falling within these normal distributions, or for having a belly that is too big, or for having a neck that is a bit wide, that we're missing the point. The point is that health is distributed differently based on our class, our race, and our income levels. And if we keep telling people that the way in which they're going to fix their health is by fixing their BMI, we are missing the bigger picture. We are missing all the things that are actually much, much harder to fix, and focusing on the one thing that is pretty damn near impossible to get right, in particular because it's a bad measure. And the thing is too, right, that doctors often know that this is a bad measure. That, I don't know about you, but I've had this experience at the doctor's office where they say something like, well, we know BMI isn't actually a really good measure of health, but you're moving towards overweight, or you're moving towards obesity. And this is a really challenging moment, in particular for people who are in this office and they're vulnerable. It's like, then why are you telling me this, right? Like, what if you know this is a bad measure, and we all agree it's a bad measure, why are you trying to shame me about my health when actually we know that blood pressure is a better measure? And I'm scoring great on my blood pressure, by the way. And we know too that people who have larger bodies experience an incredible amount of shame, both in society, at doctors' offices, in the world. And part of that is around this idea that, they're in the higher levels of BMI, that this somehow is this marker of badness, when in fact, why can't we actually have a culture that's more inclusive of different body shapes? Again, because we know that there's other measures of health. We know that, blood pressure is a great measure of health, and you can have a larger body and have great blood pressure. So there's something to be said about coming into this position of power, into a top-down hierarchical experience where the doctor is the boss and you are the patient. And they're saying these things to you that can be really shame-inducing, can be really traumatic, can be really triggering, even when they themselves know that the measures aren't that great. I mean, we start to measure BMI at the age of 2. We are bringing toddlers in the office and figuring out their BMI. It's ridiculous, right? Talk about creating a marker and anxiety for parents at a period of time in which there's huge anxiety. And we know that babies grow in different ways. They grow quickly. They put on weight. They get growth spurts. And yet we're still trying to use this linear measure of height divided by weight to show whether your kid is normal or good enough. And again, I'm putting those in quotes just to be clear. Quote, normal, quote, good enough. The only thing I'll say to you is there is this really funny Saturday Night Live skit. I don't know if you've seen it, where they do this little advertisement for baby Spanx. And so basically, like, the parents, you can find it on YouTube. It's like basically the parents are super nervous because they think their baby is too fat. And so then they put it in this like little baby spank, and it becomes this very svelte, very skinny baby. And then they can tour it around and everyone's like, oh, your baby's so skinny. Oh, it's so impressive. It is the best parody about the ridiculousness we have around shaming babies for their weight. Now, let's go back to it. Is it a misperception that BMI is biased against women? No, BMI is biased against women. It literally wasn't developed for women. It didn't include a single woman in the preliminary study. It's not for us. It wasn't built for us. And so let's not use it to judge us. Now, of course, this is always a podcast about gender. So I'm talking to you about, bigger kind of issues around health. But I'm going to say, I know so many women in my life who are so focused on their weight, the number on the scale, how that relates to BMI, the size on their clothes. And they feel bad when this isn't aligning in the ways in which they tell them. They take all these pleasurable things out of their life. Carbs, sugar, dessert with friends, pizza at a restaurant. Now, of course, if you're celiac, I'm not talking to you, so just calm down, right? Sodas. There are these whole categories of foods that women have knocked out of their diets. There's this whole amount of energy that women spend trying to fit back into clothes they bought 10 or 15 years ago. And the answer is like, girl, that outfit is done. Buy another shirt. Who cares? Step into the world, go with your friends and laugh. What I see is this incredible value and pressure internalized by a lot of women in my life about how to conform to these standards of beauty that actually weren't built for them. And what that means is there's an incredible amount of energy, there's an incredible amount of sacrifice, of pleasure, of excitement, of time with friends, of feeling good in your body that limits their ability to step into the world with confidence. And so I know I always tell you like the things we should stop doing. Like, let's stop doing that. Let's stop caring about our BMI. Let's stop caring about the weight on the scale. Let's stop caring about the size of the clothes. I don't care if you wore a size 0 in 1992. Life is so much fuller. Each year gets better. And the more we get comfortable in ourselves and a body, the more we can do. We're focused on the wrong things. If we're focused on the weight on that scale, we're not focused on making safer worlds for women. If we're focused on the weight on that scale, we're not focused on gun violence and reducing that. If we're focused on the scale, we're not figuring out how we're going to make our next career move. We're not figuring out how we're going to step into the world with more greatness. And so I want to say, let's stop focusing on the scale and let's start putting that energy somewhere else. Love, kindness, political action, career steps, whatever it is, aligned with your dreams. Let me know what you think. We do have an Instagram. We're trying to really build it up. Could you please follow it? We would love you for it. This is my plea, please. But anyway, as per usual, I love spending time with you. Thank you so much for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD, but you just get to come hang out with me. Go out and eat something delicious with a friend and laugh. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.